All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin. Beautiful, first of all, Gittin Chodesh. We have a beautiful daf ahead of us today. Begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors, Shmuley and Lee Budinovitz, dedicating the Shurim and Drashos this month as his chus for an aliyah for the neshama of Harav Peretz Avram Ben Harav Binyamin Moshe Zichron Livracha. To thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, Baruch and Bracha Rifkin, for the yard site of Shalom Ben Harav Ruvain Zichron Livracha. Today on the first of Tammuz, we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families a nechama. With that, let us begin. We have a really exciting daf ahead of us today. Baruch Hashem, we are zocha on Rosh Chodesh to begin the new perek, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem. Today's daf is Kuf Tes Vav 115. We are picking up on Kuf Yud Dalid Amud Beis 114b at the Mishnah. So I will say the Mishnah says as follows: Ha'isha shahocha hi ubayla lemedina sayam. A really interesting Mishnah. A woman goes overseas with her husband. And what happens? So the Gemara says as follows: Shalom beino lebeina, v'shalom ba'olam. This is actually very interesting. If there's shalom between the husband and wife, and there's shalom in the world, so meaning their marriage is good, and there's a general state of peace within the world. Uba v'amra meis baili, and she comes back and she says, my husband died. So what's the halacha? Tinase. The halacha is we permit her to get remarried. Now, both say the interesting part over here is we're permitting her to get remarried based on what? Based on her own testimony. But in order for that testimony to be accepted, halacha l'maisa, the Mishnah says there has to be shalom. There has to be shalom in her marriage and shalom in the world. And I will say what we're going to see, what's going on over here. Now, the truth is, this is actually, take a look at Rashi. Let's start first with the idea of shalom in the world. What does it mean there has to be shalom in the world? Rashi says over here, top Rashi, about not the top of the daf, but first in the Mishnah, she'in shaschirim. That we're talking about a situation where there's not a time of emergency in the world. The tema bididami me'omad liba. So I will say, here's what we're going to see is as follows. When a woman shows up and in Beis Din and says that my husband died, at the end of the day, what are we concerned about? Not as much that she's lying. What we're concerned about is she didn't actually see him die, but rather she saw circumstances that led her to believe that he was dead. In halacha, that is called Me'umad liba. Me'umad liba means almost like we'll call it an assessment, a situational assessment. She sees a situation, she sees a set of circumstances, and based on those circumstances leads herself to the conclusion he must be dead. Look at Rashi. For example, in Pirei Shemena Chodesh o Chadashim, Vaday ho v'lo chazar hargu listim. Hoil v'lav shaschirum ilo dechazisi demis chayshel kilkula shami avalachar. So we're going to see this more in the Gemara, but the idea is like this. So we'll say this is why the Mishnah says if she shows up in Beis Din and she says my husband died. So the Gemara says if there's shalom in their marriage, and we'll say we're going to see, by the way, the presumed marital state is one of shalom. That's the presumption. The presumption is, so we're going to see. It doesn't actually mean that she has to prove that they had shalom bayis. We assume there's shalom bayis. But the idea is here that it's a peaceful time in the world. They didn't come back from a war-torn region. Because if they came back from a war-torn region, again, the concern is she didn't actually see him die. But rather, again, she saw some circumstances that, again, she's making the assumption that he's dead. So the Gemara says, Shalom beino lebeino mecham ba'olam. But if there's shalom in their marriage, which again, I will say, again, I want to be clear, as much as the Gemara Mishnah presents this as a state, this is the assumed state. We assume that a marriage is in a state of shalom. But umilchama ba'olam, or ultimately, again, but it is a state of war. Or kitata beino lebeina, or halacha l'maisa. Let's say we know that there is a state of marital conflict, v'shalom ba'olam, but there's peace in the world. Ubasa v'amra meis baili, and she comes to Beis Din and she says, my husband died. Eina ne'amena, she's not believed. So I both say, so all the Mishnah is saying the same thing, just in two different ways. When a woman shows up in Beis Din and says, my husband is dead, and therefore, again, remember, what is she asking? She's asking to get remarried, or again, potentially trigger yibum. So halacha l'maisa, as long as there are two factors in place. Number one, shalom in her marriage, which is the presumed state, and shalom ba'olam, peace in the world. Then we believe her. But if either one of those two factors are missing, namely, we know they have a quarrelsome marriage, or we know that there's war in the world, and she shows up and says, my husband is dead, we do not believe her. We do not believe her. And I will say, I want to be clear. Why don't we believe her? Why don't we believe her? So we're going to see specifically in the case of where there's war in the world, it's not the concern that she's lying. It's the concern that she didn't actually see him die. Rather, she's made a situational assessment based on a set of circumstances that lead her to believe that he's dead, but she didn't actually see it. Mishnah ends off by saying, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Li'olam einan emes. In reality, she's not believed. Ela imkein ba'asa bocha ubegadeha kruin. So what is interesting? Rabbi Yehuda says, by the way, there's one more piece that you need. She has to look actively distraught, right? She has to look actively distraught. So she has to be crying with torn clothing. If she comes in a bit too chipper, right, and she comes in, right, like I'm like a glass half full kind of person, let's say, then it kind of raises our antenna a little bit, and we're a bit worried. Amrulo, they say, so the Rabbanan said back to Rabbi Yehuda, achazu v'achazu tina. Say, no, we don't take a look at her emotional state. And Rabbanan said, this is actually very profound. Why don't the Rabbanan say that we don't look at her emotional state? Because I will say the truth is, people emote differently. People emote differently, and people mourn differently. Some people are very stoic, and they don't express emotion. So the Rabbanan say, the way a person emotes, or ultimately, again, their emotional disposition doesn't really come into play over here. Beautiful. Says the Gemara, Tana, Shalom beino lebeina, mishun dekabari lemisni, kitata beino lebeina. So we'll say, Tana, Shalom, I'm sorry. So now the Gemara says, we'll say, see, here's what's bothering the Gemara. You tell me that in order for her to be believed, there has to be two things. There has to be Shalom, peace between her and her husband, and peace in the world. Now we'll say, here's the problem. What's the problem? How do you know? You don't know someone's Shalom bias. Right? You don't know what happens behind closed doors. You don't know at the end of the day if somebody really has a peaceful marriage, doesn't have a peaceful marriage. So Lamaisa, again, the Gemara says, you're right. The only reason it said Shalom beino lebeino was to contrast it with the opposite state. Because the opposite state, where there's a quarrelsome marriage, people often know about that. So Lamaisa, the assumed state is one of Shalom bias. Tana Shalom ba'olam, mishun dekabayla misli milchama. Just like Rabbi say again, it's not the pshat that you have to prove that there's a peaceful state in the world. We assume, it's actually pretty incredible, we assume that Shalom is the default. Shalom is the default. Shalom is the default in marriage. Shalom is the default in the world. And therefore, again, really that's only stated in order to highlight the contrast. Incredible. To which the Gemara says, what's the problem? Taimo dimilchama. And we'll say, what is the problem? So let's go through this. So Rachel shows up in Beis Din. And what happens? She says, my husband died. So I will say, so let's say again, there's war. There's war in the world, right? When we say there's war in the world, in other words, they're coming from a war-torn region. So we don't believe her. So the Gemara says, why not? Why don't we believe her? So I'll say, here we go. So my time with the Milchama, mishum da'amra bididami. Because Rabbi say, we are concerned that she did not actually see him die. Rather what? Halacha l'maisa she made, if you look at Rashi again, bididami, first Rashi in the Gemara, me'omad liba. She made a situational assessment. The Afa Gavdol Rashi says the lo chazise demis. In other words, she didn't see him die. Rather, disavra sakadaita b'chol hani deikta hava palat pitmia. So I'll say the idea is we're concerned if they come from a war-torn region, she didn't see him die. She making a situational assessment. She saw him in a particular precarious situation and assumed based on those circumstances he must be dead. To which the Gemara says, who palit? It will say she saw him in a situation where most people in that situation die. Right? And therefore, again, she's made the assumption that he's dead. Imtim salamar kevan the shalom beino lebeina natra adechazia zimnin de machule begir. I'm sorry. So the Gemara says like this: Imtim salamar kevan the shalom beino lebeina natra adechazia. So we'll say ultimately again, if there's shalom between her and her husband, ultimately again she'll make sure to see until he's dead. However, here's the problem: zimnin de machule begira oberamcha v'savra vaday meis. So you could have a situation where, let's say, she saw him stabbed by a sword or a spear. And we'll say, let's say again, she was in mortal danger as well. So what happened? She ran away. So the last time she saw her husband is that he was stabbed with a sword or a spear. So she figures to herself, Savra, vaday mace. He must certainly be dead. He must, and I will say, by the way, it's not an incorrect assumption, but the point over what we're concerned about is she didn't see him die. The Gemara says, and here's the problem: the ika da'avid samsari the chaya. Rabbi say it's possible that a person could be stabbed by a sword or by a spear, and yet Baruch Hashem still experience some type of remedy and survive. So that's what we're generally concerned about. We're concerned if she's coming from a place of milchama, and she shows up in Beis and she says, my husband is dead. She didn't really see him die. She didn't see him die. She saw a situation where he was in mortal danger. For her own safety, she had to get out. And therefore, again, she leaves with the assumption that he's dead, but maybe he's not. So both say, that's the svara over here. So therefore, again, the issue number one that the Mishnah teaches me is that a woman shows up in Beis Din and says, my husband is dead. I will say, is she believed? Is she believed? And the answer is, it depends. You need two factors: shalom in her marriage, which is the assumed state, and shalom ba'olam. She's coming from a peaceful region. If halacha l'maisa, again, either of those are missing, then we cannot rely on her sole testimony. Savar Rava lemeimar ra'avon eino kimochama. So let's listen to this. Originally, Rava thought like this: what about a famine? I would say, so let's say she's coming from a famine, a region that was experiencing famine. So she comes back to Beis Din and she says, my husband died in famine. My husband died in famine. I will say, second wide line, Kuf Yud Daled Amud Beis. My husband died in famine. So Rav originally wanted to say that famine is not like milchama, Delo Amra Bididami, because he assumes that people don't make situational assessments when it comes to famine, and she's only going to testify that her husband died of famine if what? If she saw him die. She saw him die. Watch this. So the Gemara says, Hada Amar Rava, Re'avan Hu Kimochama. But then Rava changed his position, and he passed, you know what? That famine is just like war. Namely, they were concerned that the woman makes a situational assessment and didn't actually see her husband die. Why not? Listen to this Maisa. There was a woman who came before Rava. Amrle Baili Meis Berav. My husband died in a famine. Amrla Shapira Vanata Dishizav Nafsheich. Suppose I listen to this. So Rava decides to test the story. So he tells the woman, you know what? You did a smart thing. Ultimately leaving and saving yourself. Because he says to her, it's true, there's no way your husband could have survived with the little bit of flour that you left him. So I will say, Rava kind of set her up, and Rava painted a scenario where he tells her, you did the right thing by leaving your husband behind and saving yourself. And there's no way your husband survived with that little bit of flour that you left him. And what happens? What does she say? Now I will say, Rava, of course, has no idea that was the situation. This is just what he said. So the Gemara says, Amrale mar nami yada dichi haigav no lo chaye. So the woman says to Rava, I'm happy that you know that it's true. With that small amount of flour, there is no way he could have survived. Then I will say, so what do you see from here? The woman didn't see her husband. I will say, I want to be clear. These are not situations where people are trying to lie. And they're not situations where people are trying to kind of circumvent the halacha. It's human nature. Human nature, as I will say, again, if there's one thing, and this kind of cuts both ways, that we often do is we jump to conclusions. Or we lead ourselves to conclusions. So this woman's not trying to lie. She had to leave behind her husband with an amount of food that could not have sustained a human being. That's at the end of the day what happened over here. So she's making the situational assessment. He's dead. Rava kind of gives her leading questions, and it turns out she didn't see him die. She didn't see him die. She left him behind in a famine situation with amount of food which was clearly not able to sustain a person for any amount of time. But she never saw him dead. So I will say, based on this, Hada Amar Rava, Re'avon Griyam Milchama. So I will say, Rava reversed his position, and then first Rava said that famine is not like war, meaning people don't make situational assessments by famine. Then he changed his mind after this story, and he said famine is like war. Then he changed his mind again, and he said famine is actually worse than war. Why? What does that mean? Dilu milchama ki amra meis baili b'milchama hu dila mehemna ha meis amitasa mehemna. See, I will say, if during wartime a woman makes a situational assessment, that's when she's not believed. But if during wartime, a woman says, I saw my husband die, he died on his bed, then Lamaisa, she is believed. Vilu Gabiri Avon, when it comes to famine, Ad da Amrit Meis Ukvartiv, until she says, my husband died, and I buried him. That's when she's believed. Take a look at Rashi. Mesu kvartiv dilu b'mochama savar shema baruch v'nitzav abarav he svura ech yichya. So I will say, apparently what the Gemara is saying is like this, what Rav is saying is like this. People more easily jump to end-of-life conclusions by famine than they do by war, which is interesting. Therefore, by famine, unless she's coming to Beis Din and saying, my husband died and I was at his kvura, right? I saw him buried. Ultimately, again, she's not believed. Mapola. So I will say, so really just fascinating halacha. So first of all, once again, what's fascinating over here is that we are believing the wife to testify that her husband died, but we need to make sure that she actually saw him dead and is not essentially testifying based on a situational assessment. So let's go through a couple of more cases. Mapolas. I will say, what if a building collapsed? A building collapsed. So again, she saw her husband inside of a building, the building collapsed. Hariyo kimilchama. We'll say, so a building collapse is like milchama, meaning what? We are concerned about a situational assessment. And unless, of course, she saw him dead, we cannot rely on that testimony. Damra bididami, because we're afraid she'll make a situational assessment. Shiluach nechashim ve'akravim. What about snakes and scorpions? Harein kimilchama. Harehem kimochama the amri bididami. I'm sorry. Harehem kimochama the amri kidami. So I will say snakes and scorpions, same thing. Once again, afraid of situational assessments. So the dever. What about pestilence? So amri le harihu kimochama va amri la ino kimochama. Some say pestilence is like war. Some say pestilence is not like war. Amri le harihu kimochama. Some say pestilence is like war, namely what? People make situational assessments. Others say it's not like milchama. Why? Because what do people often say? Shev shnin hava musna v'inish below shani lo azil. A person could experience 7 years of a plague, but a person never leaves this world when it's not their appointed time. So apparently, again, people know that people could survive long durations of pestilence. Therefore, we are not concerned about situational assessments. Ibailahu. So I will say, really fascinating Gemara. So Ibailahu, another question. Listen to this case. So I will say, so here's what we have so far. Woman shows up in Beis Din and says, my husband is dead. My husband is dead. So I will say, what's the halacha? Do we believe her? Right? Depends. We need two factors. Number one, shalom in her marriage, and shalom in the world, right? If those two factors are there, we believe her. If either one of those are deficient, if either one of those are missing, then we are concerned of what we call omad deliba, that she's made a situational assessment and didn't actually see her husband dead. And I will say, watch this. Let's say she shows up in Beis Din, and she says, this is a wild case. She shows up in Beis Din, and she says, I just came with my husband from Ukraine. And I will say, as far as we know, it's just another typical beautiful Ukrainian summer. She tells us, by the way, there's a war in Ukraine. So I will say, we're talking about a case now where Beis Din did not know about the war, except they're supposed to say, by the way, can you imagine living in a world like that? You know, say it's an incredible thing. Like we live in such a time of like information overload, which if you think about it, one of the reasons why sometimes we are so desensitized to events that happen, it's because there's like an avalanche of information that hits us at any given moment. That's why I will say, I have to tell you something, just lahavdil. I was listening to something. I was listening to a clip. It was actually an interview with a stand-up comedian. This is incredible. I had a long drive back yesterday. So I was listening to this clip, and they asked the stand-up comedian, how long do you have to wait before making a joke about tragic events? This was the shaila. Like, how long do you have to wait before, like, it's okay, like something's not off limits anymore? So he said it used to be in the industry, so it's fascinating, it used to be in the industry 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Now, it's about 5 days. 5 days until you can make a joke about something. So they were trying to answer, what's the pshat? He says, because the truth is, we have so much information coming at us that the truth is attention spans are so diminished. So people kind of live in something, even like majorly tragic events, right? They will say, remember again, who talks about now the shooting in Uvalde, Texas? Who talks about it? Right? Who even thinks of, how long ago was that? I don't even know, 3 weeks ago? 3 weeks ago? Not more than 3. So it's just incredible. It's just incredible how we live in a world, constant information. There was a mall bombing. The Russians shelled a mall in Ukraine. Well, remember again when Ukraine was always spoke about, the war. Yeah, you would think the war is over, right? You would think that the war is over there and that everything is back. So, okay, anyway, back to this. So the Gemara says as follows. Let's say she comes to Beis Din, and I will say, she tells us that there's war. We didn't know there was war. So I will say, now watch this. Mahu. Mi amrinon ma lo l'shaker. So Rabbi say, on one hand, we could say, listen, she didn't have to say anything, right? She could have said nothing. And if she would have said nothing about war, then what Rabbi say? Then what? And she should have amazed him. And she said, my husband is dead. But what we have said, right? Hamakam yinachim, and hopefully you'll find someone wonderful, right? That's what would have happened because Lamaisa, again, we would have never known about war. So a woman shows up in Beis Din. We don't know anything about war. The presumed state of her marriage is shalom, peace. We would have let her get remarried. She told us about this. She could have remained silent. She told us about it. So top of Kuf Tesvav, Di Baya Amra Shalom Ba'olam. She could have not said anything. Rabbi remember again, she doesn't have to lie. She doesn't have to say, by the way, there's Shalom Ba'olam. Why doesn't she have to say it? Because Lamais, again, remember, that is the presumed state. O Dilma, Kevan de Ichsika Amra Bedidami. Velo Asi Mali L'Shaker. So Rabbi say, or no. Once she established that there's a state of war, the Rabbi say then this halacha jumps in. And again, now we have a problem because, in other words, I understand she didn't have to say anything, but Lamaisa, once she did say something, there's a halachic mechanism. What a great kasha, to which the Gemara says, "V'lo asimali l'shaker umarach haskasei." To which the Gemara says, "Tashma ishnu aleinu bayis." So we'll say, "That's the shaila." O dilma kevan dischazke ba'amra b'didami v'lo asimali l'shaker umarach haskasei. Or no, once she introduces the fact that there's war, that triggers a mechanism, and the mechanism is such that we have to be concerned about a woman didn't actually see her husband die, rather she's just making a situational assessment. So let's answer this question. Tashma, ishnu aleinu bayis, ishnu aleinu ma'ara, humeis va'ani nitzalti. But since a woman shows up in Beis Din and she says, we were in a house and the house caught on fire. The house caught on fire. Ultimately, again, I was saved, but my husband died. What's the halacha? She's not believed. And I will say, why is she not believed? Now remember again, I will say, what's this case? She's showing up in Beis Din telling us about the house fire. Did we know about the house fire? No idea. So she's introducing new information over here that we did not know. And I will say, yet we see that what? She's not believed. So you see over here that even when she is the one who introduces the information, once she tells us about a situation in which we have to be concerned about situational assessment, we don't believe her testimony on its own. Shani Hasam the Amar La, that case is different. Why? Because we can say back to her, Kihechi Lididach Israchesh Nisa, Lidide Nami Israchesh Nisa. I will say this is incredible. The reason we don't believe her in that case is why? Because they say to her, look, the same way that you were saved, maybe your husband was saved also. You didn't see him dead. So if you didn't see him dead, the same way you got out, maybe he got out. Tashma, naflo aleinu ovdei kochavim naflo listim. So listen to this. Let's say she comes to Beis Din and she says, we were attacked by a group of idolaters or attacked by a group of bandits. Who mace v'nitzalti. My husband was killed, but I was saved. Ne'emenes. She's believed. So say, what do you see from here? Sounds like from here that if she is the one who ultimately, again, brings us the information, we believe her to qualify those words. So I will say, so in other words, this is the concept of Mali l'Shaker. Why should she lie? Because I will say, remember again, if she introduces information that we would not have known without her, right? And again, if she wouldn't have said anything, her situation would have been much easier. Then halacha lamaisa, she has no reason to lie, and therefore we believe her. Meaning, like this, she could have just showed up in Beis Din and said, my husband is dead. My husband is dead. And if a woman shows up and says, my husband is dead, and we assume there's shalom in her marriage, and there's no war going on in the world, then we believe her. So she comes along to the Beis and she says, we were attacked by bandits. My husband is dead. I'm alive. So the Gemara says, we believe her. So that shows you that Allah Lamaisa, when she introduces the information that we would not have known without her, we say, Mali l'shaker, why would she lie? To which the Gemara says, no, that's not a good case. I'll tell you why. Hasam kidrav idi, damrav idi, isha klei aleha. A woman is different literally because her weapons are upon her. Which means what? That halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says that when it comes to, let's say, being attacked by groups of bandits, we assume that although the bandits will go ahead and kill the man, they often will spare the life of the woman in order to violate her. So because of that, because I will say this is a different kind of case, and in this kind of case, halacha l'maisa, again, the woman is believed to say that she survived even though her husband was killed. Hahu garra debeshilhi hilula itli nura be ginoni. So I'll say an interesting case. There was a man who ultimately, again, at the end of his wedding su'udah. So we'll say, so remember again, just to give you the idea, we've seen this before in the Gemara, we'll see this again in Maseches Kiddushin, there was actually a very beautiful custom, seemed to be the norm, that what they would do is they would get a house for the chassan and kala, and ultimately make the wedding in the house. Which I will say, by the way, think about it for just a moment. If instead of spending exorbitant amounts of money on weddings, you take that money and you give it as a down payment on a house for the chassan and kala, right? Incredible. So like this, when everybody goes home, it's not just the caterer and the band who are better off, right? But Baruch Hashem, the chassan and kala are better off as well. So this is what happens. So they have that wedding party in the house. At the end of the wedding night, at the end of the wedding party, a fire broke out in the home. Amr luhu divisu. So the wife escapes. Of course, right? And that afternoon they also just sealed on an insurance policy. So again, right? So what happens? So the wife escaped, and what happens? Amr luhu divisu chazu gavroi. So ultimately, and she's yelling as the fire is going on, see my husband, see my husband. So there's a man in the fire. Asu chazu gavri charucha deshadi upista diyada deshadja. So sure enough, I will say afterwards, they come and they find Nebuch a charred body. But the body is beyond recognition. So we have no idea of knowing. Here's what we know. Someone died in the fire. And I will say an interesting twist in this. Someone died in the fire. There's the body and then there's a severed hand. And I will say this is the case. And there's a severed hand at a distance. The problem is, so we know someone died in the fire. What don't we know? Who? So remember, now we'll say, now the chap what this is we know she was in the house, he was in the house. We also know that during the fire, she's screaming, my husband. So she's claiming, I saw my husband in that fire, in that house during the fire. After the fire now, we find the charred body. There's no ability to identify it. So the Gemara says, Savar Rav Chiya bar Ava lemeimar, Hainu ishnu alenu bayis ishnu alenu ma'ara. So I will say, Rav Chiya bar Ava wanted to say this is the same case of that we had before, where halacha l'maisa, the woman comes to Beis and she says, my husband died, there was a house fire, I got out, my husband didn't. Remember, again, we'll say, in that case, we don't believe her. Why don't we believe her? Because we say to her, the same way you got out, your husband got out also. So therefore, again, Rav Chiya bar Ava wants to say the same case. Amar Rava, no, that's not a fair case. I'll tell you why. Mi dami, hasam lo ka'amra chazu gavroi. We'll say, here's the difference. In that previous case, she never claimed to see her husband in the fire. In this case, remember again, while the fire is raging in the house, what's happening? She's screaming, my husband. So she's claiming, I saw my husband in the fire. Va'od, gavra chalucha deshadi upasta diyada deshadya. Furthermore, again, we have a body. So I will say, so again, even though, and I want to be clear, we can't identify the body as the husband's, but lamaisa, there is a body. So the Gemara says, therefore, Rava wants to suggest this case is different than the house fire case that we saw before. Number one, because she says she saw her husband in the fire, and number two, because we find a charred body. Rav Chiya bar Avin would say, Kavra charucha deshadja, ema inish achrina asalat saluye, va'achilte nura, upasta diyada deshadja nura isle. So I will say, so Rav Chiya bar Avin will say, maybe not. Maybe once the fire broke out, someone came in to save the husband. And maybe the body that you found was what? was the body of the rescuer. The severed hand, Rabbi will say, was severed by the fire, right? He had his hand outstretched to save the husband, and that's why you find the body in one place and the hand in a different place. In other words, what Rabbi Avin is just saying is just as possible that the charred body ultimately, again, is or belonged to a rescuer as it did to the husband, to which the Gemara says, this. Now, okay, so what happened to the husband? So where's the husband? To which the Gemara says, this Yalid Beimuma, Umach Sufa Azal V'Arklama. It's actually fascinating. What we're concerned about maybe is the husband was burned, survived but burned. Maybe he has some severe burns. He's significantly disfigured, and he's embarrassed to go back to his wife. See, he's run away. So I will say, now again, Rav Chia bar Abin is not saying this is definitely what happened, but rather what is he saying? This could be what happened. And because although over here you do have a body, you don't know if this is the husband's body, so that this is just as probable as an explanation of events as the actual husband having died in the fire. Incredibly. So I will say, what happens if you have an Eid Echad who comes out of those will say, so what happens over here? An Eid Echad, so right, Reuven goes overseas. Rachel's at home, and what happens? So now what happens? So Reuven goes ahead. Right? And now Eid Echad, one witness comes back and says, I was with Reuven, we were in a war-torn region, and Reuven died. Reuven died in battle, or in war, not in battle. Reuven died as a result of war. So isn't Eid Echad believed to testify that Reuven died in war? So Mao, time of day, lo meshaker. So we'll say in general, why do we believe in Eid Echad when it comes to testify about the death of a husband? Because we'll say ultimately, again, people only lie about things that they think they can get away with. But something that is ultimately, again, going to be revealed. So halacha l'maisa, again, people don't lie about. Ultimately, again, so therefore, in this case over here, the Eid Echad is not going to lie. Oh, dilma time the Eid Echad mishum dehi gufa daiko min sabah v'hacha lo daiko min sabah. And maybe not. Maybe the reason why we believe Eid Echad, I will say, is why? Because we assume that a woman is going to do her own due diligence before she gets married. We had this discussion before. So we know that when the Eid Echad shows up, that's the license. But Beis Din is not really testifying or for that matter, concretizing the validity of the facts. What they're essentially giving the woman is the permission to do her own verification, right? And therefore that's what we rely on. But perhaps in a case of war, we have to go back to our original concern that in a case of war, a woman is not going to verify the facts and therefore just remarry based on the Eid Echad. Rami Bar Chama Tashma Rabbi Akiva. Well, so listen to this. Rabbi Akiva says as follows: when I went down to Narda to go ahead and make a leap year, so Matzasi Nechemia Ish Beis Deli. I found Nechemia from Beis Deli, Va'amarli, and Nechemia said to me, Shamati Shin Masin Esaisha Be'eretz Yisrael al Pi Eid Echad. I heard that in Eretz Yisrael they don't allow a woman to remarry based on the testimony of an Eid Echad. Except Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava is the only one who allows a woman to get remarried based on an Eid Echad. The Namtilo, and Rabbi Kiva says, I nodded my head to him, and I said to him, yeah, Kain had Dvarim. And I said to him, yeah, that's how we pass in Eretz Yisrael, that the rabbis don't allow a woman to get married based on an Eid Echad, only Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. So the Gemara says, Amar li, so Nechemia said to me, Amor lahem mishmi, say to them in my name, Atem yodim hamadina hazu mishubeshes begayasos. Nechemia says, you know that right now we are overrun by robbers and bandits. Kach mikulan Rabbi Gamliel Azakin. This is what I learned from Rabbi Gamliel Azakin. Shemasin ha'isha pi Eid Echad. So tell them in the name of Rabbi Gamliel, in my name from Rabbi Gamliel, that you can allow a woman to remarry based on the testimony of an Eid Echad. So the Gemara says, what does this mean? Why does Nechemia add in that the country is overrun by soldiers and marauding troops? To which the Gemara says, Lav avagav de medina zu mishubeshes, kach mikublani shemasin al pei Eid Echad. So I will say, rather, it sounds like what Nechemia is saying is like this. Even if an Eid Echad comes from a war-torn region and says that the husband died in war, halach olamai second, we allow the wife to remarry based on this eidos. Kach mikublani shemasian. To which the Gemara says, love. No, that's not what it means. Afagav Medina Zum Shubeshes, Kakamim Shamasina Pi Edechad. So Alma Edechad Mehemin. Therefore, we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that Halacha Lamaisa, an Eid Echad is believed, even if what? Even if what? Even if he's coming from a war-torn region. Because Rabbi say, again, Halacha Lamaisa, the basis of believing in Eid Echad is that a person is not going to lie about a matter that is going to become revealed. So an Eid Echad is not going to lie that a husband is dead if it's possible that what? He walks through the door the next week. Even if he's testifying about the death of the husband from a war-torn region. Amar Rava. Rava said, Ihachi, Maishna Medina Zu. So why does Nehemiah say this country is overrun by soldiers? Any place where there's war, this is what it means. This is what Nehemiah was saying. Atem yodim shemedina zu mishubeshes begayasos, v'lo efshar li lemishbak in shibesi umaisi kamei rabbanan. Nehemiah says the country is overrun by bandits and soldiers. Therefore, it's not safe for me to leave my family. If I was able to leave my family, I would come to Eretz Yisrael and I would give you this testimony myself. So instead, I'm going to rely on Rabbi Akiva to convey my testimony. Kach mikublani Rabbi Gamliel shemasina isha pi eidechad. Our Mishnah from Gamliel is you could allow a woman to remarry based on the testimony of an eidechad. But Rabbi say that is a generic statement about the power of Eid Echad. It does not specifically address our question of what? Believing in Eid Echad who claims that the husband died in war. Tashma. So we'll see another story. Two Talmidei Chachamim who were traveling with Abba Yossi ben Simai on a boat. Vitava. The boat sunk, and the Talmidei Chachamim drowned. Vehesi Rebbe Nishosein Api Nashim. And I will say ultimately again, so there are women who went ahead and testified that these two Talmidei Chachamim died, and ultimately Rebbe allowed their wives to get remarried based on the testimony of these women. But I will say drowning in water is like milchama. And I was going to say, what does that mean? That just like in war, we are concerned about situational assessments, so too when a boat capsizes, we also have to be concerned that people didn't really see these two men die, but rather what? They're making a situational assessment. That I will say, a woman, even if 100 women show up in Beis Din, testimony of a woman is like the testimony of an Eid Echad. V'katani hesi, and I will say, what do you see? You see that Allah Chalamaysa Rebbe allowed these women to get remarried. So what do you see from here? That Allah Chalamaysa, when an Eid Echad shows up and says, I saw a man die in Milchama, that ultimately he's believed. V'tizbara, Mayim she'en lehem sof ninhu, or Mayim she'en lehem sof ishto asura. I will say we're going to get into this fascinating sugya, but this I will say is a case of Mayim she'en lehem sof, water without an end, which means what? Water where you can't see the land that surrounds it. So I will say when it comes to a man where boat capsizing in Mayim she'en lehem sof, we have to be concerned that maybe the man did survive, we just can't see him. Again, we'll get into that sugya. Ishto asur al hechidami. What's the case? The amri askinhu kaman. I will say is the case of where these women showed up in Beis Din and they testify. We saw them pull the bodies out of the water. That's what's happening over here. So in other words, the women are coming to Beis Din and they're testifying. We saw them pull the bodies out of the water. Amud beis. V'chazinhu la'alter v'ka'amar simanim. The love alayhu samchinon ela asimonim. It was the top of Amud beis. What's the case? The case of us is where women show up in Beis Din and they say the two Talmidei Chachamim who were on the boat and the boat capsized and they drowned. We saw them pull the bodies from the water relatively quickly, so that once again the bodies were still recognizable and they were able to give simanim about the body. Okay, so I will say, so then this is a case of eidos. This is a case of real eidos. And in general, again, we believe halach l'mais in Eid Echad to testify about the death of the husband. So I will say, this is not a circumstantial thing. They're literally seeing the bodies. Says the Gemara, Hu Gavra, the Afkid Shum Shebechav. Gabichar was an interesting case. There was a man. So I will say, okay, there was a man who deposited Shum Shemir sesame seeds with his friend. Amrle havli shum shemi. So what? So I'll say. So again, you can just imagine the case. Ruvain deposits his sesame seeds with Shimon. Okay. So now Ruvain comes to Shimon. Give me back my sesame seeds. Amar le shak l'sinu. He says, you took them. I gave them back to you already. So vaha v'chein havyan u'bechavis rami. And Reuven said, no, you didn't. And I'll prove it to you. I'll tell you the exact amount of sesame seeds in the barrel that they're in. Go and check, and if I'm right, those are mine. Amar le, to which Shimon responds, no. Tidach shak l'sinhu v'hani achrini ninhu. You're right. There is that amount of sesame seeds in that defined barrel, but those are mine. You came in, you took yours, and I ultimately, again, replaced yours with mine. So we'll say, so who does the halacha follow? So we'll say, so again, I just want to point out, we're taking a little bit of a break from the previous cases. I will say, but kind of where we end off in the previous cases was that halacha l'maisa, we believe a woman when she shows up in Beis Din and says, my husband is dead. As long as there are two factors in place, shalom in her marriage, which is the presumed state, and shalom in the world, right? If there's not shalom in marriage, not shalom in the world, we get the problem we run into is what? Situational assessments. And that's the theme. Any time where we have to be concerned that someone says the husband died, but they didn't really see it. They're just making a situational assessment that he's dead. That's where we have problems believing the Eidos. Good. So I'll say back to our sesame seed case. So who do we believe in this particular scenario? So Savrav Chistel Meimar, Haynu Shnei Talmidei Chachamim, Hanach Azlu Alma, Vani Achrini Ninu. So I will say, is this not the case ultimately again of the two Talmidei Chachamim, right? I will say that we saw before, right? The case of the immediately previous case where two Talmidei Chachamim died, right? I will say, and we pull the bodies from the water, and we don't say, well, maybe this is two different Talmidei Chachamim who died. In other words, we assume that the same two you pull from the water were the same two who drowned. So too in this case, we assume that again, it's the sesame seeds of Reuven and not the sesame seeds of Shimon. Amrle, no, that's not fair. Mi dami, hasam ka'amri simanim, hacha shum shemi, my simani isla. Both I remember again, we just said this before, in the case where they pulled the two bodies. Remember, what do they have? They have simanim. Simanim, he was missing his front tooth, right? Had a freckle on his right cheek. You know, whatever it is, they have simanim. That's how they're identifying the bodies. I will say, by sesame seeds, you can't really have compelling simanim. Udika Amar, Cain v'Cain Havyan. And I will say, but 1 second, Reuven claimed there was 5 pounds of sesame seeds in a barrel that was marked with a big A on it. I will say, come on, Ema Chushmara Islami. That, in other words, saying that there was 5 pounds of sesame seeds, that's not a good raya. Right? I will say that's an amount, that's a weight. And first of all, people could guess that. And just number two, that's common. Amrli Markashisha, Barav Chisler Vashi, Umichai Shinan, Shema Pinan. So we'll say, so essentially, what the Gemara seems to be saying is, the halacha in this case will side with Shimon, that we believe Shimon to say, Reuven, you took your sesame seeds, and these are my sesame seeds in the barrel. That's what we assume. I will say, by the way, there's actually a simpler case, because in this case, I will say, there's a simple answer. What's the simple answer? Right? I'm sorry? Well, you could take a shvuah, but even similar to that, hamotzi mechaver alavaraya. Well, in general, whenever you want to extract money from someone, the burden of proof is always on the extractor. So Reuven wants to say, those are mine. That's fine. Prove it. So essentially, we accept Shimon's claim that you took your stuff and this is my stuff here instead. So we'll say, so do we believe that? We'll listen to this case. We'll say, if you find the kli, and on it, let's say it has a kuf, and we assume the kuf stands for karban. In this jar, you keep money for karbanos. Mem meiser. You have another jar that says mem for meiser. Dalid dimua. Also remember again, dimua is a mixture of chulin and meiser together. Tes tevel tav truma. Shebishas hasakana ayu kosvin tav tachas truma. Because we'll say, interestingly enough, in a time of sakana, Rashi says over here, what's the sakana? Shegazru shelo lekayi mitzvos. So we'll say there was a time of sakana where there was a gzeira that you can't perform mitzvos. So what happened? So a person cannot go ahead and halacha lemaisa, let's say, write on their carbonic money or truma produce. So they wrote it shorthand. So I will say, but what do you see from here? Look at Rashi. Sakana. V'lo amalo amrinon shema pinu osa tvua shenasan ba b'ksivas osa ve'lachirim. I will say, we assume that if it says kuf on the jar, that's carbonic money. And we don't assume that what? You swapped out carbonic money and put in chulin money over there. Amli Ravina Ravashi v'lo chayshin shemapinan. Is that true? Ema Seifa. Rabbi Yossi Omer. Afilu Matzah Rabbi Seinot. We'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up Emir Hashem with the rest of this conversation tomorrow. We'll catch up a little bit. It's a shorter daf tomorrow, so we'll catch up with this. I will say, Shkoyach.
Pesha also Pesha should hit her when he comes in. When she says
Correct.
So the same idea.
Same idea. Same
She
idea.
said,
Pesha
we have no idea.
correct. Pesha Asa Pesha is sometimes called that. Sometimes called Mali v'Shaker. Why should she lie? Same idea. Same idea.